In this video, we're talking about something that used to drive me absolutely crazy when I first started shooting landscapes, and that is blown out highlights. You know, those annoying big white patches in your photos where the detail, well, just disappears because of a lack of dynamic range captured by the sensor. But don't worry, I've got some tricks up my sleeve that are going to help you tame those wild highlights and make the most of your camera's dynamic range. I've also got a bonus tip at the end of the video that's seriously been a game changer for me. It's a super simple way to see if you're maxing out your camera's sensors capabilities, so stick around until the end and I promise it's dramatically going to improve your photography game. But first, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What exactly is dynamic range and why should you care? Well, imagine you're at a concert. The dynamic range is the difference between the quietest whisper and the loudest scream that a band can make. And bringing things back to photography, it's the range from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights that your camera is capable of capturing within a single shot. Now, when I first got into photography, this concept kind of confused me a little bit, right? I mean, why couldn't my fancy new camera capture exactly what my own eyeballs were seeing? Well, it turns out that our eyes are pretty incredible. They have a dynamic range of around 20 stops. Most cameras, well, they're lagging behind that at around 10 to 16 stops. That's why we need to be smart with our shooting to make up that difference. Now, you might be thinking, Will, that sounds awesome, but what the heck is a stop of light? Well, a stop of light isn't a fundamental measurement like a centimeter, a meter, or a degree of Celsius or Fahrenheit. Instead, it's a way to measure an increase or decrease in the amount of light from a point arbitrarily set in a scene as a benchmark. Let's take this picture, for example. The camera might choose this area to set a benchmark, and then here might be 1 stop darker, and perhaps here is 2 stops lighter from the benchmark that was set. So don't overcomplicate this. A stop itself means that there's just double the amount of light from the point that's been set as the baseline for +1 stop, or if you've got -1 stop, it's half the amount of light from that baseline point. And that is all the technical stuff done in this video. We're going to get practical in a second. So if a scene has 20 stops of light as you point your camera at it, but your camera sensor can only register 16 stops, things start to get tricky. So let's jump into some practical tips to help you make the most of your camera's dynamic range and to keep those highlights under control. Okay, first things first, let's talk about that weird graph thingy that you've probably seen on the back of your camera screen. You know, the one that tends to look like a bit of a mountain range. That, my friends, is your histogram, and it's just about to become your new best buddy. Think of a histogram as a bar graph of the brightness within the photo that you are taking. The left-hand side represents the shadows. The right-hand side is your highlights, and everything in between is, well, all the different other shades of tone in between. So if you see your graph smushed up to the right side, that's your camera screaming, hey, the highlights are blurred, it's going to be a big puddle of white, you've ruined your photo. And like most amateur photographers, right, when I first started out, I ignored this little graph like it was my high school math homework. Big mistake. But once I actually learned how to read it, it was like someone turning on the lights. Suddenly I could see exactly what was going on with my exposure before, this is important, right, before I even took the photo. So here's your first practical tip, right? Try to keep that graph nice and centered without any big spikes touching either side of it. And if you're shooting a high contrast scene, like a sunset, for example, you might see 2 big peaks and not much in the middle. That is absolutely okay. Just adjust your exposure with your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO to try and keep both peaks either side within the graph's boundaries the best that you can. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? Do I really need to check this for every single photo that I take forevermore? Well, no. But when you're dealing with demanding or tricky lighting situations, your histogram is an incredibly helpful tool. And hey, that little bit of effort up front absolutely beats the heck out of getting home and realizing that all of your shots are overexposed and completely ruined, right? And speaking of overexposure, that leads us nicely onto our next point. All right, here is a technique that might seem a little bit counterintuitive at first, but trust me, it absolutely works. It's called exposing to the right, or you might see it written down as ETTR if you go on blogs or read photography books. The idea behind exposing to the right is to make your exposure as bright as possible without actually blowing out the highlights. In other words, you want the histogram, which we just talked about, to be snuggled up close to the right-hand side, but not actually touching it. And why do we want to do this? Well, it turns out that digital cameras capture more information in the brighter parts of an image than they do in the shadows of an image. So, by exposing to the right and nudging everything up as far as we can without blowing out the highlights, you're giving yourself more data to work with when you edit your photos later on. And this makes total sense, right? A histogram that is shifted towards the right means that you've captured physically more light with your camera sensor. More light is obviously going to be more information as you've literally had more photons hit the sensor, and so more data has been registered. Now, I'll be honest, when I first heard about this technique, I thought it was a bit crazy, right? I mean, purposefully pushing my photos towards the overexposure that I'm trying to avoid, that seemed to go against everything that I thought I knew, and I didn't know much about photography at that time. But after trying it out and obviously messing it up a few times and overexposing an image when it didn't have to be overexposed, I realized that exposing to the right can be a powerful tool. So here is how I do it. I will take a shot and then I will check my histogram. If it's not quite touching the peak, if it's not quite touching the right-hand side, I'll just increase my exposure just a little bit. Maybe I'll slow down my shutter speed, open my aperture, or bump up my ISO. Then I'll take another shot and check it over again. And this can be a little bit of trial and error, right? But once you get the hang of it, this becomes second nature. Just remember, the key is to get the graph on the histogram, the chart, as close to the edge without going over. And if you go too far, just back it off and take another shot. Now, speaking of adjusting your exposure and ISO, that brings us on to the next point. All right, let's talk about ISO. And if you're not familiar, ISO is basically how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. The higher the ISO, the more the signal is amplified, which means you can shoot in darker conditions without your photos looking like you're just shooting into a black hole. Now this sounds great, right? Well, there is a catch. As you crank up the ISO on most cameras, you're actually reducing your camera's dynamic range. It's like a bit of a seesaw. As ISO goes up, dynamic range comes down. And when your dynamic range shrinks, it becomes a lot easier to blow out those highlights. On this chart from photons to photos.net, you can see that as the ISO on my Sony a7R increases, the dynamic range that the sensor captures decreases. On this camera and on most photography cameras, the maximum dynamic range of the camera is at the base ISO of 100. And when I first started out, I thought that high ISO was the answer to all of my low light problems. Late night street photography, crank the ISO up to 6,400. Indoor event with no lighting or very dim lighting, push it up to 12,800. Yeah, well, that didn't always work out so well because my photos often came back overexposed. These days, I'm always trying to keep my ISO as low as possible. If I'm shooting handheld in low light, I'll open up my aperture or slow down my shutter speed before I try and mess with my ISO. And if I absolutely have to bump it up, I try not to go above 3,200 unless I absolutely have to get the shot. Remember, an amazing photograph with some blown out highlights is essentially still an amazing photograph. Very few people are going to notice the blown out highlights if the photograph is of high enough quality. Now, of course, for my landscape photography, which is what I spend most of my time doing, when I'm shooting sunsets or sunrises, I'll set the camera on a tripod. Then I can use the base ISO of 100 and still capture enough light because the camera is stable, it's on the tripod, so I can open my shutter speed for long enough, however long enough it takes, to get enough light to make the exposure work. The point of doing that is that the ISO 100 maximizes the dynamic range I can capture with one shot. Of course, every camera handles ISO differently. Some newer models can push crazy high ISOs without so much of a loss in quality. But as a general rule, the lower that you can keep your ISO, the better off you're going to be in terms of dynamic range, and you're going to reduce the risk of blowing out those highlights. Now, sometimes you just can't avoid a high contrast scene, and that's where our next technique comes in real handy. All right, let's talk about HDR, or high dynamic range photography. This is a technique where you take multiple shots of the same scene at different exposures and then blend them together to create a single image with a wider dynamic range than your camera on its own with that single shot could ever possibly hope to capture. And like most amateur photographers, when I first discovered HDR, I went a little bit crazy with it. Suddenly, every landscape shot I took was a HDR masterpiece, or, so I thought, right, before I got some feedback on some of my photography. Looking back at those photos now, well, let's just say they're a bit much. It's like my photos are on steroids. every detail with the sharpening cranked up to 11, colors that would make a rainbow jealous, and there are halos around every single edge in the photo because I could never blend the photos together appropriately so they looked real. It was not what I would call a natural looking landscape photo. But here's the thing. When used subtly, and that's the key word here, right? Subtly, HDR photography can be incredibly powerful when dealing with very high contrast scenes. These days, I use it more as a way to rescue details in the shadows and the highlights rather than as an effect in and of itself. Now, most modern cameras have a HDR mode built in, which makes it super easy to try out. Just enable the HDR mode, take your shot, and the camera will do all of the heavy lifting for you. It will take 2 to 5 photos and it will stack them internally, blend them all together, and wham bam, you'll have a HDR image. Now, likely, very quickly, you're going to want more control. So you can also shoot a series of what we call bracketed exposures and blend them together in post-processing. And this is how I do it now, right? This is my approach. I'll use HDR in situations where the contrast is just too much for a single exposure to handle. Think of a landscape that's got a beautiful sun setting, where you want to capture both the bright sky and also the darker foreground. I will typically take 2 frames of the scene that I'm trying to capture. The 2 frames themselves will be 2 stops of light apart. I will then blend them together in Photoshop to get the most realistic results. And if you'd like me to put together a video on my simple but effective exposure blending process, drop a comment below this video and let me know. Now, the key with HDR photography, if you haven't got this point already, is that you've got to keep it subtle. You want your final image to look natural, not like it's just stepped out of a video game. A good HDR shot shouldn't scream, "I'm HDR." It should look like just a single, well-exposed photo. And if you're trying to do HDR photography, you've got to implement the next tip. All right, let's talk about file formats. And I know that sounds as exciting as watch paint dry, but trust me, this one is important. Now, when you take a photo, your camera is going to give you 2 main options of how to save them: JPEG or RAW. Now, JPEG is great for everyday snapshots. It's compact as a file size, it's ready to share on social media straight out of camera, and depending on your camera and the setup, it can look pretty good coming straight out the camera itself. But when it comes to maximizing dynamic range and rescuing blown out highlights, RAW photography is where it's at. Think of it like this, right? A JPEG is like a fully cooked meal. It's ready to eat, but if you don't like how it's prepared, well, you're absolutely stuck, you're knackered. A RAW file, on the other hand, is like a bag of fresh ingredients. It's going to take some time to prepare it, but you've got absolute and total control over the final result. Now, when I first started shooting, I stuck with JPEG. Well, because that's what my camera was set up to do out of the box, and the pictures looked fine. They looked nice. Plus, the RAW files, when I did experiment with that, they were huge, and I didn't really know what I was doing with them anyway. But man, right? When I made the switch from JPEG to RAW, it was like someone had unlocked a secret level in the game of photography. With RAW files, you've got so much more flexibility in post-processing. You can adjust the exposure, recover highlight details, and pull out information in those shadows that you just can't do with JPEG. It's like having a time machine that lets you go back and fix your exposure mistakes, the exposure mistakes that you made in the field. Well, to a certain extent anyway, you still can't completely rescue a blown out highlight, but you've got a lot more wiggle room. Now, I'll be honest, shooting in RAW does have a few downsides. The files are bigger, you're going to fill up your memory cards quicker, you're going to pay for more storage space on hard drives or network storage, whatever you're using to store your data. And you can't really just share your RAW files out of camera, you've got to edit or process them first. But for me, the benefits far outweigh the drawbacks. And if you're new to shooting RAW, it might seem a little bit overwhelming at first, but trust me, once you get the hang of it, you'll wonder how you ever lived without it. And your highlights, well, they're going to thank you for it as well. Now, all of this is great, right? But how do you know if you're close to blowing out your highlights in the first place? Well, as I mentioned at the top of the video, you can check the histogram, but there's actually a better way to go about doing it. All right, so here's the secret tool that I hinted at earlier on. This is your bonus tip, and this is something that I only discovered a few weeks ago. Your camera has, most cameras have, a highlight alert feature. Some people call it zebras because of how it looks on the screen. Basically, this makes overexposed areas of your image blink or flash or have stripes when you look at the back of your LCD screen on the camera or down the viewfinder. It's like your camera saying, hey, pay attention. You've blown out the highlights. Don't take the photo. Let's get this sorted first. And when I first discovered this feature, it was like someone turned a light bulb on in my brain. Suddenly, I could see where I was overexposing my images without having to squint at the histogram. And the histogram worked great most of the time, but sometimes it would just fail me. And since I found that the zebras work way better. So here's how I use it. I get my shot all set up, typically my camera's on a tripod, and then I press a custom button that I've got set up to turn on my zebras. If I see any area with the zebra lines, then I know that I've got to adjust my exposure. Maybe I'll dial down the exposure composition, or if I'm in manual mode, I'll adjust the settings to bring those highlights under control. And the great thing about this feature is, well, the instant feedback. You get the indication that something's up, you adjust, you reshoot, and rather than getting home and realizing that you've blown out a bunch of highlights and none of your shots are going to work, you can keep going at it until the shot is perfect. And now, one word of caution. Don't become totally reliant on this feature. It's a great tool, but it's not foolproof. Like the histogram, it can fail sometimes. And I'm going to be absolutely honest here, right? Sometimes a small amount of overexposure is okay, especially if it's in an area of the image that isn't crucial. And as my photography mentor recently told me as he was reviewing some of my photos, the sun is supposed to be bright, right? It doesn't matter if the center of the sun is overexposed. It's supposed to be somewhat blinding, depending on the photography that you're doing. So use the highlight alert as a guide, but also trust your own judgment as well. And if you're looking to continue to take your photography skills to the next level, why not click the video that's on the screen right now?